Hello, and welcome to Sadler's webinar on Support Daily Vocabulary Instruction in 5 Easy Steps. My name is Janine Ferrara, and I'm the Director of Product Management for all Sadler's digital and math products. With me today is Ellen Edmonds, Sadler's Executive Director of Professional Development. Today, Ellen will be talking to us about utilizing technology to integrate vocabulary development into your ELA block. You'll learn 5 easy steps that will engage students with digital tools and technology-enhanced items, increase students' vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension, and enable students to interact with vocabulary words and passages. Before we begin, let me remind everybody that your audio is on mute, meaning you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So throughout the presentation, we'd appreciate it if you have any questions, please put them in the question or chat box, and Ellen and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. With that, I am going to turn the presentation over to Ellen Edmonds.
Good day. So today we're, as Janine said, going to talk about vocabulary instruction. We'll spend a few minutes reminding ourselves of why we need to provide vocabulary instruction. We'll talk a little bit about the research on effective vocabulary instruction, specifically on direct explicit instruction, word learning strategies, and word consciousness. And then the most important part of the presentation, those 5 easy steps for vocabulary instruction. And finally, questions and answers. And as Janine mentioned, you'll be putting any questions you might have in the question section of the control panel. I hope by the end of the session today you are able to remember what you have previously learned about the rationale for vocabulary instruction, that you'll be reacquainted with the research on vocabulary acquisition and best practices in vocabulary instruction, and you'll learn a little bit about or reinforce what you already know about ways to use technology to integrate and fit vocabulary instruction into your English language arts program with 5 easy steps. The research shows that we should provide vocabulary instruction explicitly and directly in our classrooms, and we've known that for decades. And yet the research also shows that it's quite difficult for us as educators to find the time to deliver vocabulary instruction in an English language arts block that has so much packed into it. So I want you to think about the struggles you have and what might make it challenging for you to incorporate vocabulary instruction. And if those are not addressed as we move along today, please share those with me so that in future sessions I can provide information for participants and so that I might respond to you. I know we know this, but it's really important to teach vocabulary instruction, and from the most basic level, without vocabulary, we don't understand and store concepts. So in order for students to develop conceptual concepts and to have conceptual understanding, and in order for students to develop and build background knowledge, they need vocabulary. The research is really clear about that. In fact, I love this quote, "The limits of my language are the limits of my mind." If we don't have vocabulary, our growth is really stunted, and you'll see later on how very clear that is, that it's a part of it. And students who have limited vocabulary have limited background knowledge. Background knowledge is so critical to comprehension, and so the impact of vocabulary instruction in comprehension is really twofold, and we'll talk more about that later. So vocabulary instruction and vocabulary development and reading comprehension are really inextricably linked. In order to understand passages, we have to understand the meanings of the words in those passages, and the research has shown us that for decades, although education research is relatively a new field, only around for about 100 years, that's a finding of some of the most initial research done in the education world. So in order to understand what we read, we have to have vocabulary, and it's really more critical than we perhaps thought in the past. A student needs to know 90 to 95% of the words in a passage in order to to understand it. I think some of us have been misled because of the mapping that comes with decoding, that if we get about 50% of the words, there's no problem with decoding the passage. But decoding the passage and understanding the passage are two different things. And those students who fall into the category of needing to know 90% of the words are students who have learned to use context to understand the meaning of words. It's also important for students to have strong vocabulary across the content areas. Vocabulary is really critical to academic success, and that certainly makes sense when we think about reading. We know that students who have larger vocabularies are students who are more likely to graduate from high school. They're students who are more likely to be successful in all content areas, so not just in reading, and of course reading is a gateway skill, so that certainly makes sense. It's interesting that research also shows that vocabulary is really a better indicator of someone's IQ than typical IQ tests. So it really is a nice lever for understanding our students and beginning to know their reading capabilities and their learning capabilities. So there's so much research, such an abundance of research about vocabulary, about the importance of direct vocabulary instruction, about the importance of multiple exposures to words, about the importance of using games and a variety of tools to teach vocabulary. But again, the research is also clear that we don't spend much time teaching vocabulary, that out of a block of English language arts instruction, only a small segment of time is spent, about 1.67 minutes during each research reading lesson, and out of 4,469 total minutes, only about 19 minutes of vocabulary instruction. So we know that vocabulary instruction is important, and yet we find it difficult to fit it into our schedule. The research is also really clear about what we should do in terms of teaching vocabulary. And while students certainly acquire vocabulary from wide reading if they've had the necessary prerequisite instruction, it's also really important to directly and explicitly teach vocabulary. And that includes really discussing the vocabulary and not using dictionary definitions, but providing explanations of the words and examples of the words and synonyms and antonyms so students get the parameters for the words, and that students begin to be able to explain the vocabulary in their own language so that they're able to then store that information and retrieve it very quickly. It isn't something that happens just through the implicit act of reading. That direct instruction is critically important to students' vocabulary development. It's also important that we not use just one approach. For individuals who are as ancient as I, you were used to receiving a word list at the first of the week. You memorized that word list, the definitions, and an effective sentence that used that vocabulary word, and that was assumed to be good vocabulary instruction. In fact, it's not at all effective. What we do know, though, is that using one approach, so just definitional approaches or just contextual approaches, will not be sufficiently beneficial to students. We should use both definitional and contextual activities, so make sure that students understand the meanings of the words and can explain the words, but also make sure that they understand the nuances of the word meaning and the multiple meanings of the words and the parts of speech, and then in the context of a passage that they're able to pick up information about those words. Simultaneously, it's important to teach students ways of building their own vocabulary and obtaining the meaning of words from the clues in passages and other aspects of the word, such as affixes or roots. So that independent word learning is an important part of vocabulary instruction, certainly in order to acquire the number of words that students need to be successful academically. It is very important that students be exposed to the vocabulary multiple times. Research shows 8 to 14 meaningful exposures in various contexts are important for students to actually grow the vocabulary. And it's important that students be active participants in the word learning process. So when we talk about direct instruction, there's also an aspect of active engagement in the discussions of words and in providing visual images for words and learning about words. And we want students alerted to words so that they're paying attention to words and having fun with words and playing with words and are really conscious of vocabulary and the use of words. That happens through the instruction that we're talking about, but it also happens by holding students accountable for their own vocabulary learning. So assessing students is an important part of an effective vocabulary program. In every grade, we need to pay attention to the vocabulary that's critical for the content in that grade level. And so as we pick the right vocabulary words, are really focused on grade level learning and what's important in content areas and in terms of academic vocabulary. And for all students, academic vocabulary is something with which they're unfamiliar. And so it's really important to think about that. There are a number of researchers who have been very helpful in shaping our understanding of what should be incorporated in our vocabulary instruction programs. Perhaps the most popular researcher is Marzano, and I think that has to do with the accessibility of the way he approaches instruction and his familiarity with the classroom. He shares 6 steps for vocabulary instruction, and many teachers follow that approach, and many programs incorporate aspects of that. There are certainly other researchers who lend important information to our understanding of the way that we should teach. As we think about Marzano's research, I just want to point out that one of the things he has learned through the work with students is that students need to play games with vocabulary, that playing with the terms, playing with the words is an important part of an effective vocabulary program. When we think about English language learners, the National Literacy Panel helped us understand some of the things we should pay attention to. And one of the things that the National Literacy Panel said is that what's effective vocabulary instruction for all students is effective vocabulary instruction for English language learners. There are some adjustments that should be made. But when we think about English language learners, teaching the words in context becomes more important for those students. So introducing the words in the context of a passage and across multiple contexts, writing and discussion and text, so that students are exposed to the words several times is important. It's also very important for English language learners to have visual support for learning the words, so thinking of their own visual cues to remember vocabulary becomes an important part of the instruction for them. I know you're not surprised in this day and age that technology is an important tool for vocabulary instruction, and it's one area of research where the evidence is very clear that when we use technology along with direct and explicit teaching of vocabulary, students are more likely to retain the words and be able to use them in the way that we want. So their acquisition of vocabulary is enhanced and their deep knowledge of vocabulary is increased. And so we want to consider technology an important part of our approach to vocabulary instruction. As you know, one of the things that's most beneficial about the use of technology is the adaptive nature of it, to be able to design an approach for each student or for small groups of students. In doing that and providing that flexibility, we see an increased motivation on the part of students and increased engagement, and we know that that results in a higher achievement level. So being able to meet individual student needs is one important part of technology. When we think about how we teach students vocabulary, and I want us to recognize that I will be discussing technology and its role throughout these 5 steps, it's important for us to explain the vocabulary words. If you flip through a dictionary, although certainly every state standards include asking students to learn how to use reference tools like dictionaries, dictionary definitions are often circular. They often use words that students are not familiar with, and so the idea of having an explanation that uses grade level terms is really important. We can't remember a word unless we have words in our own vocabulary that we can associate with that word. So that explanation is important, and it really does need to be restated by the students so that it's their own language, not mimicking or memorizing the language we as teachers use. The visual representation or mnemonic devices are really important for students in understanding words and being able to store and quickly retrieve words. And certainly that's something that's much more accessible when we incorporate technology and use technology. And we certainly need to discuss the vocabulary. The research shows that if we talk about the vocabulary words, focusing on 1 or 2 words a day, we really increase students' knowledge base, and that's particularly supportive for English language learners. So as we introduce words in the context of a passage, we would want to talk about how the sentence context and how the paragraph context helps students understand the meaning of an unfamiliar word. That's a strategy for growing their own vocabulary. It's also something that we have come to realize is most important for students as they move into higher level coursework. It's not realistic to think that they're going to look up every unfamiliar word in a dictionary, and so being able to use context to help gain meaning and be able to understand a passage is critically important. The research also shows that glossing, using multimedia glosses like annotating in the colors that I've shown here, can be very beneficial to students. Using margin notes and highlighting and underlining is all beneficial, and that's much more accessible when we're using technology, particularly, as I said, beneficial to English language learners. And you can see a visual representation of a word that really helps us understand that meaning, and the power of that image for us in recall is very, very important. And when we think about our students, we want students practicing and using words, and the advantage of technology is that it's available and accessible to us wherever we happen to be, and becomes a powerful study tool for students. Early on, Janine mentioned the importance of next generation assessment items, and these technology-enhanced items really allow us as teachers to understand where students are and the depth of knowledge they have. It allows us to assess more critical thinking, and so you can see this drag and drop tool really allows students to begin to think about the connotation of a word, and we know how difficult that is for students to kind of get their arms around in word choice. The other thing is that technology-enhanced items are much more engaging for students. I learned early on in my teaching that using a vocabulary notebook or an online vocabulary note-taking tool helped students recall the words they used, and they used this tool much more than they used the word walls that would gather dust in my classroom. And certainly allowing students to use these resources really provides lots of support for understanding the words. These are a few of my favorite tools. Wordles are something that can be used across content areas. One of my favorite teaching channel videos is of a science teacher using Wordle to pre-teach vocabulary and in his chemistry class. So very important tool for us as students. And graphic organizers, the research shows, really help students with word association, understanding various parts of speech of words, and beginning to build and retrieve words in a way that categorization and classification is very important. We want students actively engaged. We want them using the vocabulary with a variety of exercises, and so making sure that we provide enough activities and the right activities, a balance of contextual and definitional activities is really important. So having the right words and having the right activities, making sure that we're not just using definitional activities but contextual activities as students continue to engage with words. And again, technology-enhanced activities become very important, or exercises become very important for students, both in terms of engagement, but also in terms of deepening the understanding of words, particularly figurative language. We know the standards ask students to be more competent in figurative language, and when we think about comprehension, figurative language is very much a part of more complex passages. So teaching idioms is really an important part of our instruction and providing opportunity for students to use them. We want to integrate our vocabulary instruction with what we're teaching, and so making sure that the exercises that we provide and activities we provide allow students to use the vocabulary across the content areas. This is just an example of that type of tool that asks students to think about the characters in a piece of text we're reading and how the vocabulary words we're learning might help us understand the character traits of that particular individual. So really finding lots of tools to integrate vocabulary instruction, make it more exciting, and really build word consciousness is important. We really love Sarah Ressler-Wright, our vocab blogger, and she provides opportunities for us to think about games and tools and strategies that go beyond the program but really build word consciousness and excitement about the vocabulary we're learning. The third step is really about playing with the words, having fun and using games. That Marzano's research, it's something that we don't always think about, but we know that we should make time for. And so taking advantage of all types of resources, games that we already know that we might modify. These are a couple from Vocab Gal that are available, but there are lots and lots of other resources. Online games are particularly powerful for students, so we want to make sure that we provide lots and lots of different opportunities for students to have fun with the games. I mentioned early on that it isn't enough to teach vocabulary explicitly and directly. When we explicitly and directly teach vocabulary in a school year, we typically are able to teach about 300 to 400 words in a content area. And so we know students need to be growing their vocabulary by about 3,000 words a year. We need to make sure that we're teaching students how to use context to understand the meaning of words. We want to teach them the classical roots so that they understand roots and affixes and can understand words using that information. So teaching them a range of strategies and providing practice, and that's really important. And then word learning is really incremental, and so we have to continue to review and provide support for students in being exposed to those words over time so that they cement them in their long-term memory. And part of our responsibility as teachers is really holding students accountable for the vocabulary we're teaching. And so that really requires assessing, so making sure that we're providing quiz and unit or vocabulary list types of assessments that ask students to be accountable. And if we can use technology enhanced items, we not only are teaching them how to be prepared for the types of tests they're going to be taking online, but we also really understand more about what they know about the meanings of words and the nuances of meaning. So we've covered 5 important steps for teaching vocabulary, integrating technology, and really fitting it into our classroom. When we're talking about the steps that I've mentioned, it's very easy and doable in 15 minutes a day, and most of us can find that amount of time. And we talked about why it's so critically important. I wonder if you might have any questions.
Thank you, Ellen. That was very informative, and we do have a couple of questions. The first question is, can you list or name the 5 steps again?
Sure. So when we think about vocabulary instruction and think about teaching vocabulary, I covered several different approaches, and I certainly covered the 6 steps that were suggested by Marzano. What I suggested were 5 steps that really are a hybrid of a variety of research approaches. So step 1 is really about focusing in on the words and explaining those words and restating those words if you're the student, having visuals or showing those words and discussing those words. So that's the first step. The second step is engaging students with exercises that allow the students to use the words in multiple contexts, and those exercises should be a balance of contextual and definitional activities. The third step is about playing games with the words, having fun using technology-based games and a variety of resources. That word play and word consciousness is important. The fourth is teaching students word learning strategies, so how to use context, figurative language, Greek and Latin roots, various affixes. That ability to independently learn new words is important. And then finally, reviewing those words in an ongoing way so students continue to use them, and assessing students so they're accountable for the vocabulary that they learn.
Great, thank you. Another question is, can you post the websites you recommend again?
Sure. Let me go to that slide and show it, and then we could also share that, I think.
Yes, once Ellen has those websites up, you can also take a screenshot of them so that you have them on your own device. And while people are doing that, I'll go to the next question. Is there a resource for grade level content vocabulary suggestions?
Grade level content vocabulary suggestions. So, there are grade level word lists, and those word lists include Marzano's and Coxhead. Marzano has basic word lists and background word lists. There are a number of word lists, and they'll do that are grade level affiliated. Typically, students' vocabulary is equivalent to their reading comprehension level. So if you look at the Lexile levels, and of course, we know complex text has more aspects than Lexile, but if you look at grade level Lexile levels, words will typically be seen again and again in text at a grade level, and so that's an option. I think one of the values of choosing a program is that the right words are going to be in that program and the right types of activities. It is difficult, I believe, to find the range of activities you need online outside of a program, or to create them if you're a teacher, because you need to see the words in context. You need to be able to provide for students phrase, sentence, and paragraph context opportunities, and you need to be able to provide definitional opportunities, including synonyms and antonyms. So I encourage you to think about using a resource, but certainly if you have the time, there are ample sources online for both activities that can be done with words and certainly the right words to teach. It takes quite a bit of work, and our Vocab Gal provides a range of activities that supplement what we do in the program that we have.
Great, thank you. Another question is, how do you make an online vocabulary book?
My experience is that it works well in either, generally speaking, I've done it in Word, although I've had some students do it in Numbers or Excel. And I have various templates I've used depending on the grade level. So I set up a table for the students at the first of the year. I share the document with them, and I ask them to make sure that the first column is always the word, so it can be sorted alphabetically. So the word, the parts of speech it represents, the explanation of the word, a visual of the word, a sentence. You can vary what's in the columns, but those are sort of the minimum things. And then students add to it over time, and when we would go to the computer lab, that would be one of the tasks they would have, would be to add to it. It could sometimes be done as homework, and students used it as a reference when they were writing, and they found that to be a really powerful tool. When I would ask them to look for a more appropriate word or a meatier word, they would refer to that word list, and that became a really great resource for them that they carried from grade level to grade level.
Great. Boy, the questions are coming in. That's great. I think you had mentioned this, but if you could repeat it, can you tell us some great blogs to go to for vocabulary ideas?
Well, I have the web resources up for some tools for focusing on individual words. I mentioned Vocab Gal as a resource. There are certainly lots of other bloggers and resources out there. Marzano does quite a bit of work. Some of his resources are accessible without a fee. Some require a fee. But we can certainly share more of those if they're interested.
Great. And the question that always comes up is, will the presentation be available after the webinar? And yes, we will be sending you a link to the presentation. And I'm going to put in the chat box my name and my email. If you would like additional information on using technology to integrate vocabulary development into your ELA block, or on any of the programs that Ellen referenced in her webinar today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. If we did not get to your questions, I will send them to Ellen and we will respond to all the questions. But again, we'd like to thank you for your time today and hope to see you on future Sadlier webinars. Thank you so much.